The Galactic Medical Station hung in the darkness of space like a massive jewel, its lights twinkling against the void. This wasn't just any hospital. This was where the most powerful species in the galaxy came when their own doctors couldn't help them. 7 different alien civilizations had built this place together, filling it with the most advanced medical technology anyone had ever seen. Inside one of the sterile white corridors, something heartbreaking was happening. A dragon sat waiting, and if you've never seen a real space dragon, you need to understand something. These weren't the mythical creatures from Earth's old stories. These were actual living beings, massive and ancient, with scales that shimmered like crystals and could stop a starship's weapons cold. Dragonkind had been flying between the stars for thousands of years before humans even invented the wheel. They were respected. They were feared. They were powerful. But right now, Mema Thera looked anything but powerful. Her scales, normally a brilliant azure blue that seemed to glow with inner light, had gone dull and gray. She sat hunched in a waiting area designed for beings 3 times her size, her massive head lowered, her tail wrapped protectively around herself. Through the observation window, she could see her baby lying motionless on a medical platform, connected to machines that beeped and hummed. The hatchling was dying, and there wasn't a damn thing anyone could do about it. Or at least, that's what every single doctor in this fancy station kept telling her. The problem was something no one had ever seen before. Deep inside the baby dragon's chest, there was something called a fire sac. All dragons have them. It's the organ that lets them breathe fire, that regulates their body temperature, that makes them dragons. But this little one's fire sac had somehow twisted around during development, inverting completely. Instead of venting heat outward like it was supposed to, it was trapping everything inside. In less than 48 hours, that baby dragon was going to burn alive from the inside out. Thera had brought her child here 2 days ago, the moment she realized something was wrong. She'd flown through 3 star systems without stopping, her baby cradled carefully in her claws, racing against time. The Galactic Medical Station was supposed to be the best. They could cure diseases that would wipe out entire planets. They could regrow limbs. They could transfer consciousness between bodies, for crying out loud. But they couldn't save her baby. And she'd asked everyone. The Vailian doctors had been first. These beings looked like massive octopi, with 12 tentacles that could work independently, each one equipped with surgical tools that made Earth's finest scalpels look like Stone Age knives. Their head surgeon had spent 3 hours examining the hatchling, running scans, consulting with colleagues. Then he'd emerged from the examination room and delivered the verdict with what might have been sympathy in his alien voice. The chest cavity is too small, he'd said through the universal translator everyone wore. Our instruments cannot fit through the access points. Even our smallest surgical tentacles are too large. To force entry would cause catastrophic damage. I'm sorry. Thera had tried not to beg. Dragons had their pride. But desperation makes you do things you never thought you would. She'd offered him treasure from her hoard, gems that could buy entire space stations. She'd promised genetic material, something dragons never shared with outsiders. She'd even offered a military alliance, her family's warrior traditions pledged to help the Vailian people with any conflict for the next 100 years. The surgeon had refused. It wasn't about payment. It was about physics. His tools simply couldn't do what needed to be done. Next came the Shin, beings made of living crystal who understood energy in ways that seemed like magic. They could manipulate light, electricity, even the bioelectric fields that surrounded living things. Their healers didn't cut and stitch. They guided the body's own energy to heal itself, worked directly with the life force flowing through cells and tissue. But the Shin physician had shaken her crystalline head after her examination. The fire sac is organic tissue, she'd explained, her voice chiming like wind through glass. Our techniques work with energy fields and electromagnetic patterns. To manipulate physical matter directly, especially something as delicate as this, we would need to channel too much power. The heat alone would kill the patient. This is beyond our capabilities. More treasure offered. More promises made. More refusals given with what seemed like genuine regret. The crash came next, insectoid beings whose compound eyes could see across dozens of spectrums simultaneously and whose hive mind doctors could consult with thousands of medical experts instantly. They took one look at the scans and didn't even enter the examination room. Dragon physiology is too alien from our own reference database, their representative had clicked through his translator. We have no framework for understanding this anatomy at the cellular level. To attempt surgery would be experimenting blindly. We cannot help. One by one, Thera had gone to every species represented at the station. The methane-breathing Vrel with their nanoscopic surgical drones. The silicon-based Karath who specialized in exotic biochemistry. The telepathic Mindari who could literally see inside a body without cutting it open. Every single one had examined her baby. Every single one had said the same thing in different words. Impossible. Too small. Too delicate. Too different from what we know. Sorry. The waiting area had cleared out as the hours passed. Other patients came and went, taken into treatment rooms, emerging healed or at least stable. But Thera just sat there, watching her baby through the glass, watching the monitors show the internal temperature slowly rising as the inverted fire sac continued malfunctioning. 48 hours had become 36, then 24. Now she had maybe 18 hours left. She'd stopped begging. What was the point? The galaxy's finest medical minds had spoken. Her baby was going to die, and she was going to have to watch it happen. In the ancient days, before space travel, before the galactic community, dragons would have taken their dying young to mountain peaks or deep caves, somewhere private and sacred. But there was no privacy here in this sterile station with its artificial gravity and recycled air. That's when Thera noticed the human. She'd seen him before over the past 2 days, always in the background, wearing a gray maintenance jumpsuit with some kind of identification badge clipped to the chest. He pushed a wheeled bucket and carried a mop, cleaning the floors that thousands of beings walked across every day. Humans were new to the galactic community, only discovered about 5 years ago. They weren't impressive by galactic standards. No natural armor, no special abilities, relatively short lifespans. They'd barely figured out faster than light travel. Most species saw them as cute primitives, eager and enthusiastic but not really players on the cosmic stage yet. This particular human had brown skin and kind eyes, and he'd been mopping the same section of floor near the waiting area for the past 20 minutes, moving slower and slower. Thera realized with a start that he'd been listening to everything. Every consultation, every diagnosis, every refusal. He'd heard it all while pretending to work, staying invisible the way service workers always did. Now he'd stopped mopping entirely. He stood there, mop in hand, staring at the medical display showing her baby scans. His face had that look Thera had seen before on warriors analyzing an opponent, on engineers studying a complex problem. He was thinking hard about something. And then, to her complete surprise, he set down his mop and started walking toward her. The human approached slowly, respectfully, the way you might walk up to a wild animal you didn't want to startle. Thera barely registered his presence at first. What could a janitor possibly want with her? But then he spoke, and his words came through her translator in that strange, flat way that human language always sounded. I know this is going to sound crazy, but I think I might be able to help your baby. Thera's head lifted slowly. She stared at this small creature standing in front of her, holding a mop like it was a staff of office. He barely came up to her chest, even with her sitting down. His species had no natural weapons, no armor, no special abilities that anyone knew about. And he cleaned floors for a living. The absurdity of the moment almost made her laugh, except she'd forgotten how to laugh 2 days ago. The doctors have all said it's impossible, she replied, her voice coming out more bitter than she intended. The finest medical minds in 7-star systems have examined my child. They all say the same thing. The surgery cannot be done. The human nodded like he'd expected that answer. Yeah, I heard all that. I've been listening. And they're right, mostly. It can't be done with their tools, their techniques, their way of thinking about the problem. He paused, then added, but I'm not them. Now Thera did laugh, a short, harsh sound that made the human flinch slightly. You're a maintenance worker. What could you possibly know about advanced xenobiological surgery? Nothing, the human admitted freely, which surprised her. Most beings would have gotten defensive at that. I don't know anything about alien biology or advanced medicine. But I know about small spaces and delicate work. Can I look at those scans? The ones on the public display? Thera gestured with one claw toward the medical monitor mounted on the wall. She had nothing to lose by letting him look. The human walked over and started studying the 3-dimensional image of her baby's internal structure, rotating it with his fingers on the touch-sensitive screen. He zoomed in on the chest cavity, examined the inverted fire sac from multiple angles, traced the blood vessels and nerve clusters with one finger like he was mapping a route. He stood there for almost 5 minutes, completely silent, his face intense with concentration. Thera watched him, too tired and heartbroken to even feel curious anymore. Behind her, she heard footsteps and turned to see a Valerian surgeon passing through the corridor. The doctor noticed the human at the medical display and made a disgusted sound through his breathing tubes. That's quite enough of that, the Valerian said sharply. Those are private medical scans. Your maintenance staff. You have no clearance to view patient information. The human turned around, and Thera saw something interesting happen. His face had changed. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by a calm determination that reminded her of dragon warriors before battle. I'm viewing public display information in a public area, he said quietly. And I'm trying to save a life that all of you said couldn't be saved. The Valorian's tentacles writhed in what Thera had learned was their version of contemptuous laughter. You? A human? You think you can succeed where trained surgeons have failed? Your species barely understands basic anatomy. You still cut into bodies with metal knives like barbarians. You haven't even mastered cellular regeneration. You're right, the human said again, that same easy admission. We're primitive compared to you. We don't have your technology or your knowledge. But sometimes primitive is exactly what you need. He turned back to Thera. The problem isn't complicated, not really. That fire sac needs to be rotated 180 degrees and reattached. The blood vessels need to be reconnected, the nerve tissue needs to be preserved, and it all needs to happen without rupturing the sac itself or damaging surrounding organs. Exactly, the Valerian said with satisfaction. And the access point is only 7 millimeters wide. No surgical instrument we have can fit through that space and still be capable of performing such delicate work. The mathematics of it simply don't work. Too large, and we cause fatal damage entering. Too small, and we lack the strength to manipulate tissue. The human smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. 7 millimeters is plenty of room for human hands. We've been doing delicate work in small spaces for thousands of years. He held up his hands, flexing his fingers. Thera saw for the first time how different they were from Valerian tentacles or Shen energy projections. 5 separate digits on each hand, each one capable of independent movement, each one tipped with a small, flat nail. They looked almost fragile. My father was a watchmaker, the human continued. Back on Earth, before we had digital everything, we had these devices called mechanical watches. Hundreds of tiny parts, some of them smaller than a grain of sand, all working together with precision measured in fractions of seconds. My dad taught me how to repair them starting when I was 8 years old. You know how small some of those parts are? The screws in a watch balance wheel are 0.5 millimeters across. The hairsprings are thinner than human hair. And I learned to work with them using tools sized for human hands and human fingers. The Valerian was shaking his head. This is absurd. Watches are machines. This is living tissue, a living being with a biology you don't understand. You would kill the patient through sheer ignorance. Maybe, the human admitted. But the patient is dying anyway, right? In what, 18 hours now? He looked at Thera, and she nodded slowly. So what's the actual risk here? That I fail and the baby dies? That's already happening. The way I see it, you've got nothing to lose and a chance, even a small one, to gain everything. A crowd was gathering now. Other medical staff, patients, visitors, all drawn by the sound of raised voices. Thera heard them murmuring in a dozen languages, all being translated into a cacophony of opinion. Most of it was skeptical. A Shin physician floated closer, her crystalline body chiming softly. This is dangerous, she said, not unkindly. Human, I understand you mean well, but you could cause immense suffering. A failed surgery of this type, performed incorrectly, could make the death much more painful. Have you considered that? The human's confident expression flickered for just a moment, and Thera saw doubt cross his face. Good, she thought. He should doubt himself. This was insane. But then he took a breath and steadied himself. I have, he said quietly. And it terrifies me. But I also know that doing nothing guarantees an outcome. At least this way, there's a chance. The station administrator arrived, a creche with compound eyes that reflected the corridor lights in rainbow patterns. What is the meaning of this disturbance? Human Worker Designation BD 7743, you are creating a disruption. Return to your assigned duties immediately or face termination of employment. The human, BD 7743 apparently, didn't back down. I'm offering to attempt a medical procedure that could save a patient's life. A patient that every doctor in this station has given up on. You have no medical credentials, the administrator clicked angrily. You have no training in xenobiology. You are a custodial worker. If you attempt to perform surgery and the patient dies, this station will face legal consequences. The dragon clans could declare blood feud. This is absolutely forbidden. That's when Thera made her decision. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the fact that this small, insignificant human was the only being in the entire station who was still trying to help her. Maybe it was just that she'd rather her baby die with someone fighting for its life than simply watching it slip away. She stood up, her full height making everyone around her step back instinctively, and spoke with all the authority of her ancient bloodline. "I invoke the right of last champion." The corridor went dead silent. Even the translator devices seemed to pause. The Valyrian surgeon's tentacles went rigid. The Kresh administrator's antennae stopped moving. The right of last champion was old law, older than the Galactic Medical Station, older than the alliance between species. It was dragon law, written in the founding treaties that created the neutral zones. If all recognized healers have declared a case impossible, Thera continued formally, the patient's guardian may designate any being of their choice to make the attempt, and no law or regulation may prevent it. "I choose this human. What is your name, Janitor?" The human straightened up, and despite everything, despite the absurdity of the situation, Thera saw pride in his stance. "Jake Turner, and I'll need 6 hours to prepare, access to your machine shop, and someone to show me how to use the sterilization equipment properly." The machine shop was located 3 levels down from the medical wing, a place where maintenance workers fabricated replacement parts for the station's systems. Jake had been there plenty of times before, fixing broken air recyclers and water processors. But he'd never been there like this, with a dragon watching his every move and half the station's medical staff crowding around the doorway to see what the crazy human was going to do. The Kresh administrator had tried everything to stop this. He'd cited regulation after regulation, threatened legal action, even attempted to revoke Jake's station access. But the right of last champion was ironclad. It had been written into the station's founding charter specifically because dragons were one of the founding species, and their laws had to be respected. The administrator finally gave up and simply declared that the station bore no legal responsibility for whatever happened next. Then he stormed off, his chitinous legs clicking angrily against the floor. That left Jake alone in the machine shop with Thera sitting near the entrance, too large to fit inside but watching through the doorway. A handful of curious medical students had gathered as well, whispering to each other. Jake caught snippets of their conversation through his translator. Most of them were taking bets on how quickly he'd give up. One Valyrian student was running an actual betting pool on whether Jake would even figure out how to turn on the fabrication equipment. Jake ignored them all. He had 6 hours, and he couldn't waste time on anger or pride. First, he needed to understand exactly what he was working with. He pulled up the hatchling's medical scans on his personal datapad, one of the few pieces of Earth technology he'd brought with him to the station. The image quality wasn't as good as the fancy holographic displays the aliens used, but it was enough. He rotated the image, zoomed in on the chest cavity, measured the access point with the PATS annotation tools. 7 millimeters. Tight, but workable. The fire sac itself was about the size of a chicken egg, which made sense for a baby dragon. It was connected to the respiratory system by 2 main tubes, fed by a complex network of blood vessels, and surrounded by nerve clusters that regulated its function. The inversion had twisted everything, cutting off proper blood flow and causing the heat regulation to fail. If he could just rotate it back into position and reconnect everything properly, the organ should start functioning normally again. Should. That was the word that kept echoing in Jake's mind. Should work. Probably would work. Might work. He pushed the doubt away and got to work. The station's fabrication system was advanced beyond anything on Earth, capable of creating objects at the molecular level. But Jake quickly realized that all that advancement came with a problem. The system was designed for alien hands, alien ways of thinking. The interface assumed you wanted to build something big or something incredibly complex. It kept trying to suggest improvements to his designs, kept asking if he wanted to add energy components or smart materials. Jake spent 20 minutes just figuring out how to tell the damn machine that no, he really did just want simple metal tools shaped exactly the way he specified. He started with scalpels. The station's medical scalpels were energy-based, cutting with focused beams of light or sound. They were precise and cauterized as they cut, preventing blood loss. But they were also too large for the access point, and more importantly, Jake didn't trust himself with them. He needed tools he understood, tools that worked the way Earth tools worked. He designed simple steel blades, sharp as razors, some straight and some curved. The fabricator hummed and produced them in minutes, each one emerging from the construction chamber perfectly formed. Next came hooks and retractors. These were the tools he'd need to move tissue aside without damaging it, to hold open spaces while he worked. Jake designed them based on his father's watch tools, scaled up slightly but still small enough to fit through that 7mm opening. Some of them looked like tiny fishing hooks. Others resembled miniature crowbars, bent at precise angles. Each one had to be smooth, with no rough edges that could tear delicate dragon tissue. A Shin medical student floated closer, her curiosity apparently overcoming her skepticism. "Why are you making such primitive instruments?" she asked, her voice chiming like bells. "We have molecular-level surgical tools that could work at far greater precision." Jake looked up from his work. "Because I don't know how to use those tools," he said simply. "I've got 6 hours to prepare for the most important surgery of my life. I don't have time to learn alien technology. I need to work with what I know, what my hands understand." He held up one of the tiny hooks. "My dad taught me to use tools like this when I was a kid. I've practiced with them for 20 years. These might look primitive to you, but in my hands, they're extensions of my fingers. That's what I need." The Shin student considered this, her crystalline body refracting the shop's lights into rainbow patterns. "There is wisdom in that," she admitted finally. "We are taught to always use the most advanced tools available. But perhaps we forget that the tool is only as effective as the being using it." Jake gave her a grateful nod and went back to work. The clock was ticking. 4 hours left now. The hardest part was the suture material. Dragon tissue was different from human tissue, tougher and more heat-resistant. The station's medical database had information on dragon biology, but most of it was about adults, not babies. Jake had to extrapolate, to guess how strong the thread needed to be to hold tissue together without tearing through it. He designed strands of carbon nanofiber, thinner than human hair but incredibly strong. The fabricator created them as a single spool, like thread on a bobbin. Threading the needles was going to be a nightmare. Jake fabricated magnifying glasses, real old-fashioned optical lenses, because electronic magnification would be useless inside the hatchling's electromagnetic field. He made 3 different sizes, testing them against his own vision until he found ones that gave him the clearest view. They weren't perfect, but they'd work. 2 hours left. Jake moved to the sterilization chamber, a small room attached to the machine shop where equipment was cleaned. This part was crucial. Infection could kill the hatchling just as surely as a failed surgery. A Valerian nurse had grudgingly agreed to show him the proper procedure after Thera had asked politely, which coming from a dragon was basically a command that nobody wanted to refuse. Jake loaded his tools into the chamber and watched as they were bathed in ultraviolet light, bombarded with antibacterial compounds, and subjected to a heat treatment that would kill any microorganism known to galactic science. While they sterilized, he started thinking about the actual procedure, walking through it step by step in his mind. He'd need to make the initial incision along the chest cavity where the scales were thinnest. Get through the outer layer without damaging the organs underneath. Spread the opening carefully. Slip his instruments through that 7mm gap. Locate the inverted fire sac. Carefully, so carefully, detach it from the surrounding tissue where it had adhered. Rotate it. Find the blood vessels and nerve connections. Reconnect them one by one. Suture everything in place. Close the incision. And do all of it without the baby waking up, without the fire sac rupturing, without causing any additional damage. It sounded impossible when he laid it out like that. Jake found himself thinking about his father, alone in his repair shop back in Portland, bent over a workbench with a jeweller's loop strapped to his head, his hands steady as he manipulated parts too small to see with the naked eye. The secret, his dad used to say, is to not think about how impossible it is. You just focus on the next step, then the next one after that. Before you know it, the impossible thing is done. 1 hour left. The tools were sterilized. Jake laid them out on a clean tray, organizing them in the order he'd need them. Scalpels first, then hooks, then retractors, then the suture material and needles. Everything had to be perfect, had to be exactly where his hands expected it to be. In surgery, you couldn't afford to waste time looking for the right tool. The word had spread throughout the station by now. Jake could see dozens of beings gathered outside the machine shop, pressed against the windows, floating in the corridors. Medical staff, other patients, even some of the station's administrative workers. Everyone wanted to see if the human janitor was really going to try this. Most of them probably expected him to back out at the last minute, to realize how insane this was and admit defeat. Jake packed his tools carefully into a sealed container. He'd need to transport them to the operating theater without contaminating them. A creche medical student offered him a sterile transport case, sliding it across the floor without a word. Jake nodded his thanks and transferred everything carefully. Thera stood up as he emerged from the machine shop. "Is it time?" she asked, and Jake heard the tremor in her translated voice. For all her size and power, she was just a mother terrified of losing her child. "It's time," Jake confirmed. "But I need to tell you something first. I've never done anything like this before. I'm going to try my absolute best, but there's a real chance I'll fail. If that happens, if your baby dies during the surgery, I need you to know that I'm sorry in advance. I'm sorry for not being good enough." Thera lowered her massive head until her eyes were level with Jake's. They were golden, ancient, filled with an intelligence that had watched civilizations rise and fall. "Jake Turner," she said formally, "you are the only being in this entire station who looked at my dying child and said I will try. Whatever happens in that operating theater, you have already given me more than anyone else could. You have given me hope. For that, I will be grateful for the rest of my life." Jake felt something break loose in his chest, some tight knot of fear he'd been carrying. He reached out and touched one of Thera's scales gently. It was warm, thrumming with energy. "Then let's go save your baby," he said. The walk to the operating theater felt like a mile, even though it was only 3 corridors away. Every being they passed stopped and stared. Some of them looked curious. Others looked skeptical. A few looked actively hostile, like Jake was committing some kind of crime by even attempting this. But Thera walked beside him, and nobody was stupid enough to challenge a dragon. The operating theater was empty except for monitoring equipment. Nobody wanted to assist with this surgery, which meant Jake would be working alone. Fine. He was used to working alone. He began scrubbing his hands with old-fashioned soap and water, using the same technique his father had taught him for getting truly clean. The chemical sterilizers the station used would leave residues that might be toxic to dragon biology, so he stuck with basics. 30 minutes now. The baby dragon lay on the operating platform, sedated but still alive, scales rising and falling with shallow breaths. Time to find out if a human janitor could do the impossible. Jake stood over the operating platform, looking down at the tiny dragon hatchling. The baby was barely the size of a house cat, its scales a pale blue that would darken as it matured. It was breathing, but each breath looked painful, labored. The monitors around the platform showed vital signs that Jake barely understood, but he could read the temperature gauge well enough. The internal heat was climbing. 98 degrees Celsius now, when it should have been around 70. The clock was ticking faster than anyone had predicted. Outside the operating theater, the observation gallery was packed. Jake could see them through the reinforced glass, dozens of beings from half a dozen species, all watching him. Medical students with their data pads ready to record his failure. Senior physicians who'd come to witness what they thought would be a cautionary tale. Even some regular station visitors who'd heard about the crazy human and wanted to see the show. The gallery had speakers so they could hear everything happening in the theater, but Jake couldn't hear them. Small mercy, that. Thera was pressed against the glass, as close as she could get. They'd made her wait outside because her electromagnetic field would interfere with the monitoring equipment. Jake could see the desperation in her golden eyes. He gave her a small nod, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel, then turned back to the patient. His hands were steady. That surprised him. He'd expected them to shake, expected the fear to make him clumsy. But the moment he picked up the first scalpel, something shifted in his mind. It was like stepping back into his father's workshop, that calm, focused state where nothing existed except the work in front of him and the tools in his hands. His breathing slowed. His vision seemed to sharpen. The initial incision had to be perfect. Jake had studied the scans for hours, memorized where every major blood vessel ran. He placed the scalpel against the thinnest part of the chest scales and applied pressure. The blade was sharp enough that it sliced through cleanly, barely any resistance. A thin line of blood welled up, darker than human blood, almost purple. Jake dabbed it away with sterile gauze and continued the cut, extending it about 2 centimeters. That would be his access point. In the gallery, he heard a murmur of voices. One of the Valyrian doctors was narrating for the students, his tone dripping with skepticism. Note how crude the technique is. Simple mechanical cutting with no cauterization, no energy sealing. He'll cause excessive bleeding. But Jake had expected that. Dragon blood clotted faster than human blood, something he'd learned from the medical database. A few seconds after he made the cut, the bleeding slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely. He used 2 of his smallest retractors to hold the incision open, creating a small window into the hatchling's chest cavity. And there, just visible through the opening, was the problem. The fire sac looked wrong even to Jake's untrained eyes. It was swollen, discolored, and twisted at an unnatural angle. Worse, It had adhered to the surrounding tissue in several places, stuck there like it had been glued. Those adhesions would need to be carefully separated before he could even think about rotating the organ back into position. Jake selected one of his smallest hooks and slipped it through the opening. 7mm wasn't much space, but his hands were small by galactic standards, and his tools were smaller still. The hook went in smoothly. Now came the delicate part. He needed to feel his way through tissue he couldn't directly see, navigating by touch and by what the monitors could show him. He's going in blind, someone in the gallery said, audible shock in their voice. He doesn't even have a nanoscopic camera feed. They were right. The station's surgical equipment included cameras small enough to see individual cells. But those cameras needed power sources that would have heated up inside the hatchling's electromagnetic field. Jake was working with nothing but his tools, his hands, and old-fashioned optical magnification. He'd positioned his magnifying glasses over the incision, giving him a clear view of the opening, but everything deeper than that was touch and instinct. The first adhesion separated cleanly. Jake felt it give way under gentle pressure from his hook, felt the fire sac shift slightly. Good. 3 more to go. He worked slowly, methodically, talking himself through each step in a low murmur. Second adhesion, lower left side. Applying pressure. Feeling for the separation point. There. That's got it. Minutes ticked by. 5. 10. 15. Jake's back was starting to ache from bending over the platform, but he didn't dare straighten up. Every movement had to be controlled, deliberate. One slip, one moment of carelessness, and he could rupture the fire sac or sever a major blood vessel. The baby would die in seconds. 20 minutes in, disaster struck. One of the monitors started beeping urgently. Jake's eyes flicked up to see the hatchling's heart rate spiking, its brain activity increasing. It was waking up. The sedation was failing, just like the doctors had warned might happen. Dragon juveniles metabolize drugs differently than adults, and there wasn't enough data to predict how long the anesthesia would last. In the gallery, the Valian doctor's voice cut through the alarm. The patient is rejecting the sedation. Procedure must be terminated immediately. If the hatchling fully wakes, its instinctive fire response will trigger. The human will be incinerated. Jake heard it, understood it, and kept working. He couldn't stop now. The fire sac was half detached, twisted at an impossible angle. If he pulled his tools out now, the organ would tear itself apart from the tension. The baby would die anyway, just more slowly and painfully. The hatchling's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy, unfocused, but awareness was returning. Jake saw the little dragon's chest start to expand, the instinctive breath that would come before fire. He had maybe 3 seconds before everything went catastrophically wrong. Jake did something he hadn't planned, something that came from pure instinct. He started humming. It was a song his father used to sing while working, an old lullaby that probably dated back 100 years or more. He didn't remember where his dad had learned it, didn't remember all the words. But he remembered the melody, soft and gentle and rhythmic. The effect was immediate and inexplicable. The hatchling's eyes focused on Jake, its chest expansion paused. The baby dragon was listening. Jake kept humming, letting the sound wash over the confused, half-awake patient, while his hands continued their work below. The third adhesion separated. Then the fourth. The fire sac was free now, floating loosely in the chest cavity, still twisted but no longer stuck in place. Impossible, someone whispered in the gallery. It's responding to auditory stimulation. But dragons don't imprint on other species. They shouldn't be capable of being soothed by alien sounds. Except this one was. Maybe because it was so young, barely aware of what species even were. Maybe because it was in pain and any comfort was welcome. Maybe because on some level, all babies recognize when someone is trying to help them. Jake didn't know and didn't care. He just kept humming and working. The rotation was the hardest part. Jake had to use both hands now, one hook to hold the fire sac steady and another to gently push it around. It didn't want to move at first, resistance from the blood vessels and nerve connections still attached. He applied more pressure, feeling the tissue stretch. Too much and something would tear. Not enough and the organ wouldn't rotate. He found the balance point through pure feel, applying steady, even force. The fire sac turned. Slowly, so slowly, it rotated back into its proper position. Jake saw the moment it clicked into place, saw the shape suddenly make sense against the surrounding anatomy. Now he just had to reconnect everything before the hatchling fully woke up or the detached blood vessels caused fatal bleeding. The sutures were the finest work Jake had ever attempted. Each blood vessel was barely a millimeter across, and they had to be connected precisely or blood wouldn't flow correctly. He threaded his needle, squinting through the magnifying glass, and began the first stitch. His hands moved almost automatically, muscle memory from thousands of hours repairing watches taking over. Each knot had to be perfect, tight enough to hold but not so tight it crushed the delicate vessel walls. One vessel reconnected. Then another. Then the nerve clusters, even more delicate, requiring sutures so fine Jake could barely see them even with magnification. The hatchling was breathing faster now, the sedation almost completely worn off, but it was still listening to his humming, still calm enough not to panic. The last suture went in. Jake tied it off and carefully withdrew his instruments, checking as he went to make sure nothing was bleeding, nothing was damaged. The fire sac sat in its proper position now, connected and functional. In theory. If Jake had done everything right. If dragon biology worked the way he thought it did based on scans and database entries. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. The monitors showed the same readings, the same elevated internal temperature. Jake felt his heart sink. He'd failed. All that work, all that precision, and the organ still wasn't functioning. He'd missed something, connected something wrong, damaged something critical without realizing it. Then the temperature gauge flickered. Dropped by 1 degree. Then another. The fire sac began to pulse rhythmically, glowing faintly beneath the hatchling's skin. The baby dragon took a deep breath, and this time it wasn't labored or painful. It was clean, natural. The scales began to brighten, color flooding back into them like someone had turned on a light from inside. The gallery exploded into noise. Jake couldn't make out individual words, just a chaos of voices in a dozen languages, all talking over each other. He ignored them and focused on closing the incision, applying bioadhesive along the cut he'd made. The wound sealed smoothly, leaving just a thin line that would probably disappear entirely as the hatchling grew. Jake stepped back from the operating platform, his legs suddenly weak. He'd done it. Somehow, impossibly, he'd actually done it. The baby dragon was going to live. The operating theater stayed silent for exactly 5 seconds after Jake stepped back from the platform. Then the doors burst open and Thera came rushing in, completely ignoring the protocols about electromagnetic interference and sterile environments. She moved faster than Jake thought something that large could move, crossing the room in 2 bounds and lowering her massive head over her baby. The hatchling looked up at its mother and made a small chirping sound, the first noise it had made since Jake started the surgery. Thera made a sound back, something deep and rumbling that Jake felt in his chest even though he had no idea what it meant. The baby's scales were glowing brighter now, a healthy azure blue that matched its mother's natural color. Its breathing was easy and regular. The temperature monitors showed 72 degrees Celsius and holding steady. Normal. Healthy. Alive. Jake realized his hands were shaking now that the surgery was over. The adrenaline that had kept him steady was draining away, leaving him feeling hollow and exhausted. He sat down hard on the floor, not caring that it was undignified or that dozens of beings were watching through the observation window. His legs simply wouldn't hold him up anymore. That's when the gallery erupted into chaos. The doors flew open and medical staff poured into the theater, talking over each other in a dozen different languages. The Valerian chief surgeon pushed through the crowd, his tentacles moving in patterns Jake had learned meant extreme agitation. Impossible, Kelmuth kept saying, examining the hatchling with his medical scanner. The adhesions were separated cleanly. The blood vessels are connected with perfect precision. The nerve clusters show no damage whatsoever. This is impossible. Human hands are too large for this kind of work. Human medicine is too primitive for this level of success. A Shin physician floated closer to Jake, her crystalline body refracting the theater lights into rainbow patterns across the walls. "May I examine your instruments?" she asked, her chiming voice more respectful than any alien had sounded when talking to Jake before. Jake gestured weakly toward his tool tray. The Shin picked up one of his scalpels, holding it up to her light-sensitive body, analyzing it from every angle. "This is just metal," she said, confusion evident even through the translator. "Shaped metal. No energy components, no smart materials, no molecular edge refinement. How did you achieve such precision with something so basic?" "Practice," Jake said simply. His voice came out rougher than he expected. 20 years of practice with tools exactly like those. My hands know what to do with them. I don't have to think about it. More medical staff crowded around the tool tray now, picking up hooks and retractors, examining them like they were alien artifacts from some unknown civilization. In a way, Jake supposed they were. Human tools, designed for human hands, using human logic. The galaxy had spent thousands of years developing increasingly complex medical technology, and somewhere along the way they'd forgotten that simple could work just as well. A young Valerian medical student, one of the ones Jake had seen running the betting pool in the machine shop, approached hesitantly. "I need to ask you something," he said, his translator making his voice sound uncertain. "When the patient began waking up, why didn't you stop? Standard medical protocol dictates immediate termination of any procedure when sedation fails. You could have been killed." Jake thought about that for a moment. Because stopping would have guaranteed the baby died. At least by continuing, there was a chance. Maybe not a good chance, but better than zero. He looked at the student directly. Sometimes following the rules gets you a predictable outcome. Breaking the rules gives you a possibility of something better. The student's tentacles curled in what might have been understanding or might have been shock. It was hard to tell with Valerian body language. The creche administrator arrived, clicking and clacking his way through the crowd. Jake expected another lecture about regulations and protocols and unauthorized medical procedures. Instead, the insectoid being stopped in front of Jake and executed what the translator identified as a formal gesture of respect in creche culture. "I was wrong about you," the administrator said stiffly. "I believed humans were too primitive, too reckless, too confident in their limited abilities. But you have demonstrated something we had forgotten. Sometimes limitations force innovation. Sometimes primitive methods succeed where advanced techniques fail." He paused, his compound eyes reflecting Jake's tired face 1,000 times over. "The station administration would like to offer you a position as a medical consultant, if you're willing." Jake blinked, not sure he'd heard correctly. "I'm a janitor. I have no medical training. No degrees, no certifications, nothing that qualifies me for any kind of official medical position." "You have something more valuable," a new voice said. Jake looked up to see a being he didn't recognize, something that looked like it was made of flowing water held in a vaguely humanoid shape. The translator identified it as Counselor Myrith of the Aqueous Collective, one of the Galactic Medical Council's senior members. "You have practical skill developed through years of dedicated practice. You have the ability to improvise when standard procedures fail. And you have the willingness to try when everyone else has given up. These qualities are rare in modern galactic medicine. We have become too dependent on our technology, too rigid in our thinking." Myrith flowed closer to the operating platform, examining the sleeping hatchling with whatever senses its species used. "There are other cases like this throughout the galaxy. Patients with conditions too delicate for our standard tools, too unusual for our protocols, too small or too different for our specialists. We've been turning them away, telling them nothing can be done. But perhaps we've simply been using the wrong approach." Thera lifted her head from her baby and looked at Jake with those ancient golden eyes. "Jake Turner, by the old laws of my people, I owe you a life debt. You saved my child when no one else would try. My family's honor demands that I repay this debt. What do you want? Name anything within my power to give." Jake thought about treasure hoards and military alliances and all the things dragons supposedly offered. None of it interested him. "I don't want anything," he said honestly. "I'm just glad your baby's okay. That's enough for me." Thera made a rumbling sound that the translator struggled to interpret, finally settling on something like affectionate exasperation. "Humans," she said, shaking her massive head. "You're all impossibly stubborn and ridiculously selfless. Very well. If you won't accept a traditional debt payment, then I'll do this instead. I'm petitioning the Galactic Medical Council to recognize human medicine as a legitimate medical discipline and to certify human techniques for use in cases where conventional methods have failed." The gallery went quiet. That kind of petition was serious business. It meant humans would have official standing in the galactic medical community, would be consulted on difficult cases, would be respected as equals rather than primitive newcomers. Counselor Myritha's watery form rippled with what might have been approval. "The Council will consider this petition seriously. Today's events have demonstrated that humanity possesses valuable medical capabilities that complement our existing techniques. I will personally sponsor the petition." Over the next few hours, something unexpected happened. Word spread throughout the station, and beings started approaching Jake with questions. A Shin physician wanted to know if human techniques could help with a patient whose crystalline structure was too fragile for energy-based medicine. A Valerian surgeon asked about microsuturing techniques for a species whose blood vessels were smaller than their instruments could handle. Even the creche administrator returned with files on 6 different cases that had been declared impossible, asking if Jake would at least look at them. Jake found himself surrounded by the galaxy's finest medical minds, all of them suddenly interested in learning from a human janitor. It was surreal. Yesterday he'd been invisible, just another maintenance worker keeping the station running. Today he was being treated like he'd discovered some revolutionary new science. But he hadn't discovered anything. That was the truth that seemed to be slowly dawning on the alien medical staff. Humans hadn't invented some new technology or found some secret technique. They'd just retained skills that the rest of the galaxy had evolved past. Small hands, simple tools, patience developed through working with delicate mechanical objects. Things that seemed primitive were actually incredibly useful in the right situation. 3 days later, Jake stood in a training room with 5 medical students from different species, teaching them the basics of mechanical precision work. He'd brought out some of his father's old watch repair kits from his quarters, actual antique tools from Earth. The students practiced on synthetic tissue, learning to work with steady hands and simple metal instruments instead of their usual high-tech equipment. It was slow work. The Valerian student kept wanting to use his tentacles for everything when sometimes just 2 fingers worked better. The Shin kept trying to add energy manipulation to the techniques when pure mechanical action was what was needed. But they were learning, adapting, starting to understand that sometimes the old ways had advantages. Thera visited the training room regularly, her baby riding on her back now, healthy and growing fast. The hatchling seemed fascinated by Jake, always watching him with curious eyes. Thera said that in dragon culture, the being who saved your life became part of your family. Jake wasn't sure what that meant practically, but having a dragon friend seemed like it might come in handy. The council's petition went through. Human medicine was officially recognized. More humans started arriving at the station, recruited from Earth specifically for their delicate manual skills. Watchmakers, jewelers, microsurgeons, anyone who worked at the scale where human advantages mattered. They filled a niche the galaxy hadn't known existed, handling cases that had been impossible before. Jake kept his janitor job, though. He liked the work, liked the freedom to move through the station and see everything. Besides, someone had to keep the floors clean. But now he had a second job too, consultant and trainer, teaching the galaxy that sometimes primitive was exactly what you needed. 6 months after the surgery, Jake received a communication from Earth. His father had heard about what happened, about the surgery that had made humans respected in the galactic medical community. The message was short, just a few words in his dad's handwriting. Told you those watch skills would be useful someday. Proud of you, son. Jake smiled and looked out at the stars beyond the station's windows. Humanity had joined the galactic community as the newest, least impressive species. But they'd found their place by being exactly what they were, stubborn, creative, willing to try impossible things with simple tools and steady hands. The galaxy was learning a new lesson, one human at a time. When everyone else says impossible, ask a human. They specialize in proving the universe wrong.